sinister family of alchemists, the Perserad. In their quest to understand the universe, they conducted countless chemical experiments. These mad alchemists created numerous biochemical disasters everywhere. Dragons that spat venom, 20-meter monsters pumped full of anabolic substances, and even some mosquitoes that sucked out brains. However, for unknown reasons, 300 years ago, the family went into decline. However, he, the most talented descendant of the family, known as Izzo Perserad, is also considered the greatest alchemist of the century, and he swears that he will create biochemical weapons that will rival the gods and restore the family's glory. He spreads his arms, declaring that at this very moment, the final calamity is about to be born, something he has been working on for the past 400 days. He tells Dirty Rat to begin the process, but to keep the purification area at 70%. The big rat, whose name is Cheese, replies, telling him to stop calling him Dirty Rat. Then he announces that the fluids are at 99% and the body temperature is at 25 degrees. The signals were stable. Izzo orders him to add 52 grams of black sulfur, and he obeys. Then 160 grams of white mercury, and he obeys. Continuing, he asks for 366 grams of yellow salt, and the guy obeys. However, at that moment, stability drops to 72%. Izzo immediately orders the tank to be opened, all fluids drained, and depressurization to prepare for the unveiling. The rat disables the safety measures and announces that the creation tank is ready. The purple symbol on the device begins to glow, and Izzo is thrilled because finally he has created the most dangerous chemical weapon the world has ever seen. He gazes at the glorious image of the calamity he is about to unleash. Spreading his arms, he declares that with such a terrible form, he will take a step forward and begin the conquest of the world. However, he sees the foot, he sees the heart, and soon realizes that what was born was not a monster. Izzo, shocked, asks what the hell this thing is. He says he needs to see it up close because something is wrong. The rat warns him that it's dangerous, but he approaches anyway, telling him to shut up. Stating before the girl, he finds it strange. Perhaps it was some kind of mimicry technique where the calamity disguises itself as a woman. That would explain those two giant spheres, which are surely energy storage sacks necessary to power the calamity. He reaches out to touch, saying he needs to test. Judging the softness and texture, he is sure that damn thing was a normal person. He then wonders where the angelic arm of extinction he had transplanted went, or the jade eye of the sorrowful empress that he had implanted. Not to mention that he had also placed a Type 1 tireless heart, but he wasn't hearing any blood movement. Suddenly, something opens its eyes and the rat tells him to be careful. Izzo is about to realize something, but it's too late as it attacks, pinning him to the ground. Strangely, Cheese just sighs, saying what a pity, but it seems he will have to carry on the Perserad legacy. He even starts thinking about how the tombstone will read, the genius alchemist who was not slain by the city's heroes, but by his own experiments. Izzo immediately orders him to help, threatening to stuff a bunch of worms into his cheese if he doesn't. The rat gets mad, saying he's being way too cruel. However, the red liquid that it spilled was actually just some remnants of a flaming slug. Izzo declares that he, the greatest alchemist, would not be killed by his own creations. He tells Cheese to remember that he had instructed him to add the soul extraction liquid, so this creature wouldn't have the courage to hurt him. Cheese tries to recall and says he doesn't remember doing that at all. That's when he recalls a day when Izzo brought that supposed liquid and told him to stop drinking it and add it to the production. Cheese had opened it, liked the smell, and decided to pour it into his own drink instead. Now in the present, he is certain that everything is doomed. Izzo returns to the final calamity, declaring that he is her master and ordering her to obey. Suddenly, she rises. He asks why she's getting so close, and the girl, as if responding, grabs him. The boy nearly explodes from a flurry of deadly attacks. Spiraling into chaos, he shoves her away, confused. He runs off, shouting that he was exposed because of that damn dirty rat, and that he now needs the purification spray. He presses the button, and the girl is trapped again. She keeps banging against the glass, but she doesn't seem able to speak. Meanwhile, Izzo is dousing himself with purification spray. At that moment, he remembers another familiar face. He starts digging through the files, and Cheese asks what's going on. Then he finds records about the original body of Experiment 2252. He is certain it is the same woman from back then. Cheese suddenly remembers and says that's the girl they found without arms or legs. However, he recalls that her hair was purple back then, so why is it yellow now? Izzo replies that this is the least of their problems. First, they need to understand this personality change. We then see a year ago in the Golden City at the Queen's Bank. Everyone was going about their day peacefully, but nearby a chemical bomb had been planted. When the timer hit 0, gas began spreading everywhere. Meanwhile, Izzo and Cheese were casually relieving themselves in the bathroom. The rat comments that he's sure the dragon toxin has already been released. Izzo reaches into his bag, pulls out a mask, grabs a weapon, and now it was time to begin. In the bank, everyone had collapsed on the floor as the two walked in. A guard ordered them to freeze, saying the bank's owner was on the way. However, Izzo fired a shot from his little gun, and the guy turned into a slime. He even said that the damn thing had become much cuter now. At that moment, Cheese stopped in front of a mother and child and said he had found what he liked most. Desperate, the mother begged him not to kill her son, but Cheese did something much worse. He stole the child's lollipop and walked away sinning, saying this one was a good one. With that, they locked the entire place and began melting down the bank. A bomb was installed, the whole thing exploded, and they accessed the vault full of cash. The rascal was delighted that everything had gone perfectly. Later, outside, they were walking back home, humming happily. Isao called himself the genius alchemist of crime, saying there was no better name for him. Meanwhile, Cheese wanted to go to the bar and celebrate the night, but our boy immediately refused, saying that last time he kept giving money to those ugly women, so no way. All of this was going to be invested in the final calamity. Once they finished this experiment, the whole city would become their playground. Considering the opportunities, Cheese admitted that it actually made more sense. They looked at each other and agreed that when that happened, they would go to the mayor and dance to the music. They laughed, saying they felt alike, but suddenly, they heard a loud noise. They immediately crouched down and Cheese said someone must be following them, but Iso was sure it hadn't come from so close. With smoke rising from his toy, there was a man named Homurk who worked at the city's security office, and he was chasing a girl who was completely worn out, collapsed on the ground. Cheese scoffed that they were being underestimated. They had just robbed a bank, and this guy was chasing someone else. The brute said that indeed one unit from that group was strong enough to have killed 5 of his detectives. But what he really wanted was the target list the Hellhounds had sent her to eliminate. If she cooperated, maybe he would spare her life. Then he laughed, saying he had forgotten that every member of her unit had their vocal cords cut so they couldn't talk to anyone. Suddenly, she reached for something on her back, but her movement was quickly stopped. Homurk smirked, calling her a very naughty girl for trying something in this situation. That's when he saw she was reaching for a teddy bear and wondered if she actually liked that thing. At that moment, she grabbed his pants and let out some distorted sounds, but he simply smacked her on the back of the head and slammed her back to the ground. Stepping on the poor girl, he sneered, saying that, apparently, this weird bear was more important to her. He tossed it near her face and delivered a final blow to the creature. Damn, what a cruel bastard. He then said that since she wouldn't give up the list at the very least, he would take her body to claim a reward. But that was when Izzo appeared, clapping his hands, saying that he had finally found the so-called nemesis of criminals in this place. The old man pointed at him, asking who the hell he was. Then our boy introduced himself as the most cruel and wicked criminal in this city, as well as the greatest alchemist of all, Izzo the Baron. Apparently, he was hiding his family name. Cheese cleared his throat, and Izzo quickly added that he almost forgot to introduce his right-hand man, Dr. Madrat. Cheese immediately corrected him, saying he wasn't Izzo's subordinate, since they were on equal footing in all of this. Besides, his title was Madman, Dr. Madman Rat. Izzo pointed out that his name was now too niche because it had mad twice, but Cheese argued that when a word is repeated, it sounds way cooler. That's when Homurk interrupted them, saying he wasn't here for some childish game, and they'd better run back to their mommies. The protagonist scoffed, saying that apparently he was going to be underestimated once again. Both of them threw sacks of money on the ground, saying this was the result of their latest work. The old man saw the 2 piles and was immediately certain that these bastards were the ones who robbed the White Queen's bank. The 2 started acting like showmen, telling him not to praise them so much. At that moment, Homurk sighed and pulled out his gun, saying this was the first time he had encountered people so happy to be accused of something. He then aimed at them and warned that normally bullets were too expensive to waste on amateurs like them, but today he would make an exception. Isao thanked him and said he was eager to witness the sharpshooting skills of the city's #1 marksman. He then wished him luck, but as soon as he pulled the trigger, the gun wouldn't fire. He felt the strange heat, and suddenly, his entire arm started trembling. A wave of weakness hit him and he stumbled forward. That's when he realized that inside the money bags was poison. Isao smirked, saying it was too late for him to notice. That gas would bring anyone down after inhaling it for 8 seconds, but he had already been breathing it in for over a minute. Homurk then asked what the hell his goal was. Were they trying to save this woman? But Isao scoffed, saying he was a villain, as if he would ever do something as heroic as saving someone. Then he pulled out his little gun and said they despised the so-called heroes of the city. The guy turned into a green slime and scurried away immediately. Cheese laughed, saying they could finally head home and have some fun. That's when he noticed Izzo standing there with the girl and asked what the hell he was doing. Izzo remained silent, just staring, saying he was curious to see how long she would last. She had lost an arm and a leg, and her wounds were already starting to rot. Homurk hadn't gone easy on her either, and the poor thing didn't have a single intact rib left. He pulled out a syringe and muttered that he detected several toxins in her blood. It was a miracle she was even alive, which was precisely why he was so curious to see what was so special about this woman. But Cheese scoffed, saying that regardless, she wouldn't survive much longer, so they should just head back already. Not to mention, there was no way he was actually thinking about saving someone. Izzo responded that it was truly impossible. He was the most wicked person in the Golden City. Saving someone would be an insult. He grabbed his cloak, and Cheese admitted he was afraid that, for a moment, Izzo really wanted to save that girl. Looking back, he saw her driving herself and remarked how incredible it was that she could still do anything in that state. However, he decided to forget all of this. After all, There were countless people rotting away in this place. A thunderclap echoed and rain began to pour in that very alley. As the two walked away, they spoke of how the sins of the city would be washed away and everything would be forgotten. The poor girl was left behind, staring at her destroyed teddy bear. She crawled once more, feeling a brief joy as she pulled it into her arms. With that, she lost consciousness and drifted away. Or maybe not, because Ezo came back, didn't he, folks? The scene then shifted to the nightmare nest in the operations room. She's asked if Izzo understood what they were doing there. Izzo replied that they were performing an operation, to which the big rat countered that what they were really doing was saving someone's life. He asked since when his friend had started this nonsense of saving people and forgotten their goal. Izzo insisted that he had never forgotten. The goal was to become the worst villain of all, and to restore the lost honor and glory of the ancient Perserid family. However, for this plan to work, they needed a biological weapon known as the Final Calamity, and a body that could accept this calamity needed countless negative emotions: pain, despair, rage, and sorrow. But the most difficult condition was that this weapon needed to have a sliver of kindness. The experiments kept failing because they never found someone who fulfilled that last condition. That was why they needed this woman. She met all the requirements. She said he understood, but she was far too injured and could die at any moment. Ezo said that was exactly why they would begin the Final Calamity immediately. He ordered the rat to prepare the cocoon of despair as they were about to start. That was when they used the arms of a blazing angel, an emerald eye from the sorrowful empress, and an infinite, unstoppable heart from a modified model. All of this would be used to create the cocoon of despair. With that, he declared it was time to begin the first miracle. Back in the present, he pressed her image against the glass and confirmed that the resemblance was undeniable. She's asked what they should do. Izzo stated that tomorrow they would begin testing. His friend asked what they would do if she turned out to be a failure. Izzo answered that they would dispose of her. He didn't keep failures by his side. A place filled with masks, notes, maps, and a poster of a very healthy-looking girl. That was Izzo's room. He was sleeping peacefully until he remembered the precise blow he had taken. That made him roll over in bed, wondering why he couldn't sleep. He seemed confused about everything and decided that even though this place was incredibly secure, it wouldn't hurt to check on things. He reached the core and saw that she was still there. At least now he could relax. However, he soon noticed that she seemed to be trembling. That was when he wondered if the great Final Calamity was afraid of sleeping alone at night. He turned away, saying it didn't matter to him. She was just the result of an experiment, probably defective anyway. However, he stopped again, remembering her attack and her sadness. Sighing, he gave in and opened the chamber, telling the Final Calamity to hurry up, since he would take her somewhere better to sleep. Obviously, she lit up with happiness, blushing. They walked through the level 7 observation room for high-risk creatures. There was a high-risk experiment there known as the Wild Dragon. It growled that once it was free, it would swallow Ezo whole. There was also a creature called the Abyssal Eye, which warned that the moment it escaped, it would torment his mind forever. Izzo smirked, saying that those two were the friendliest around, which was why he was leaving her right there between them. The girl looked a bit confused, but he was already walking away, saying he would go back to sleep while the monsters yelled at him. Back in his room, he sat on the bed, mumbling that at least now the Final Calamity wasn't alone. Finally, he could sleep peacefully. Meanwhile, the Wild Dragon turned to the Abyssal Eye, asking why there was a human girl placed between them among powerful creatures. The Abyssal Eye admitted it had no idea, but it saw that Ezo had called her the Final Calamity. The dragon burst into laughter, saying it was impossible for such a tiny human to be the so-called Final Calamity. The Abyssal Eye laughed as well, saying it was probably just another one of Izzo's countless failures. Truly something to laugh at. The little girl banged on the glass in distress, but the dragon warned that Izo's crystal glass was unbreakable. Not even in its B0 form could it scratch it. The Abyssal Eye told her to give up. It had already fired countless laser beams at the glass, and nothing had happened. But suddenly, the girl stopped for a second. Her hand began to transform into something red, blazing with flames. Both of them flinched, and as soon as she touched the glass, it began to crack. They stood there, watching, trying to understand what was happening, and suddenly, the entire glass chamber exploded. She stood there, confused, staring at her own hand, not understanding what happened. Meanwhile, the dragon's jaw was on the floor, and the big eye was now trembling with fear. The dragon immediately knelt, apologizing, saying that he now deeply respected his big sis, but all he wanted was for her to help him escape from there. The Abyssal Eye said the same thing, swearing that from now on, he would serve her if she helped him break free. While all of this was happening, Issa was sleeping peacefully, and Cheese had drunk himself into unconsciousness. That was when the facility's alarm blared. Faster than firefighters getting dressed, the big rat asked what was going on and why it was a level 4 alarm. Hiso explained that this signal only triggered when at least 3 barriers had been destroyed. Inside the elevator, he stated that the ones who had escaped were the dragon and the Abyssal Eye. However, something else had also escaped from room 203, which was strange because he was sure that room had been empty. Immediately, Ezo pulled out his tablet, saying he needed to see this for himself. That was when he saw the Final Calamity destroying all the glass. Instead of being worried, he cheered, celebrating that she had activated the arm he had transplanted. Meanwhile, Cheese wanted to know why the girl, who was supposed to be in another room, had ended up there. They arrived at the high-risk experiment area. Both of them stepped into the room where the dragon and the abyssal eye were wreaking havoc. Izzo asked if the two had had enough fun already. I think the creatures suddenly tucked their tentacles between their legs. The dragon, however, stepped forward, snarling that he had found the bastard who had imprisoned him for so long. It was time to pay the price for that. But Cheese pulled out a gun and fired a shot toward the dragon. A yellow mist spread in the air, and the creature immediately asked what that was. Izzo smirks, saying it was a grenade filled with over 200 dragon spider eggs. And as a dragon, he should know exactly what that meant. The beast shuddered, admitting that those damn spider creatures were a subspecies of dragons. They could infest and feed on other beings, and anyone infected by them would die. Izzo praised him, saying at least he was intelligent. However, while this happened, the abyssal eye took advantage of the distraction, charging up a blast, ready to evaporate them both in that instant. But Izzo knew the abyssal eye's weakness. The more energy it accumulated, the more exposed its eye became. A flashbang exploded right in front of the creature, making it crash to the ground, blinded. It groaned in agony, screaming that the bastard wanted to blind him forever. Izzo then asked if the two of them were going to keep making a mess, or if they were ready to go back to their cages. However, the dragon declared that they wouldn't give up, not now that they had Big Sis on their side. The abyssal eye agreed, saying she could melt the glass of this place, so Izzo had no chance against her. Izzo frowned and asked who this Big Sis was supposed to be. The two creatures immediately bowed, and the girl stepped forward between them. Now he knew exactly who they were talking about, and if she had really lost control, things would get difficult. The dragon grinned, saying it had been a long time since he had seen Izzo make that kind of fearful face. Then he leaned toward the girl and whispered that Izzo was a cruel man. He had trapped all the creatures in this place and treated them like lab rats. The final experiment continued, advancing with a powerful presence, striking fear into everyone. Cheese urged Izzo to activate the emergency protocol immediately. However, Izzo revealed that, unfortunately, there was no way to guarantee 100% security against the final calamity. Suddenly, in a quick movement, she leaped toward them. Izzo flinched as she tackled him to the ground. The massive dragon laughed, saying he couldn't wait to see Izzo beg for mercy before he got infested with eggs. If he took too long to answer, Big Sis would take his life. However, that was when he noticed something strange. She wasn't attacking him. She was doing that cruel move again. He scowled, asking what the hell she was doing to him. Izzo tried to push her away and asked if she was done yet. She tried to climb onto him again, but he sighed and said he understood what she wanted. She didn't want to sleep in this place. She wanted to go somewhere else. She pushed against him again, and he scolded her for acting like a dog. The wild dragon called out to her, telling her to use that move again, the one that had shattered the glass. Izzo then realized why she had suddenly activated that power. They returned to the elevator, but she kept pressing all the buttons, making a mess. Meanwhile, the wild dragon was strapped into a reflective containment suit, yelling at Izzo to come back and remove it before everyone in the area started laughing at him. At the abyssal eye's chamber, Izzo had left a bunch of onions. Then we saw a baby nine-headed hydra. The creature opened its eye, and right beside it, the calamity was staring at it. She kept looking at it, and Izzo noted that, apparently, she refused to sleep in the lab. The problem now was figuring out where she would stay for the night. She said it was simple, just let her sleep in his room. But Izzo immediately called that idea crazy. She was an experiment. Suddenly, the scene changed to a recorded surveillance feed, where someone was calling for Detective 5682. It seemed like they were in some kind of hotel, but the footage was glitching. Suddenly, the images stabilized, and they wondered what had happened in that place for there to be so many bodies. All that remained were skeletons, and they asked what kind of terrifying creature could have done this. Suddenly, the detective began coughing violently, and the person recording asked what was happening. He looked at his dirty hand and warned that he had been poisoned. At that moment, someone approached, saying that another meal had arrived. Looking up, he found himself face to face with a black dragon and a rather dangerous-looking woman. The artist certainly gave them the attention they deserved. The creature on her back lunged at the detective, and with that, the camera cut off. That was an extra chapter I ended up narrating without realizing. But now, we're back with our boy and his rat. Right when Cheese told him to go to sleep, Izzo immediately refused. But the rat insisted, saying that the disaster girl could only feel calm near him. Izzo scoffed, saying that was obvious after all. He had made sure to add an ingredient that guaranteed she wouldn't harm him. That's when Cheese revealed that he hadn't added the soul extract at all. In fact, he had drunk it like it was wine. Izzo was about to yell at him, but his friend quickly explained that it was his fault for giving orders while he was drunk. While he argued with the rat, saying that if she lost control, everyone would die, she was peacefully playing with the aquarium. That's when he realized she had already dived in and was pulling at the hydra. The creature seemed to be trying to flee, but she quickly followed it behind a rock. The girl was determined, to say the least. Meanwhile, Izzo yelled at Xiaoju that the Hydra was not a toy and ordered her to get out. Cheese continued eating his cheese while our boy kept demanding that she get out of there. She didn't obey, so he grabbed her by the leg and started pulling. The suffering this girl endured was unreal. He fell to the ground. You know what happens next? She had many abilities and one of them was compression, using gravitational force. Izzo was a talented alchemist, but he had no physical strength to withstand such magic. Meanwhile, Cheese was laughing at his misery. With a bruise forming on his face, Izzo commanded that disaster never enter Xiaoju's tank again. Cheese started walking away, saying Izzo could keep looking after the disaster girl. Izzo wanted to argue, but the big cat told him to calm down. The girl was very gentle and delicate. Just don't let her go into berserker mode or the consequences would be unimaginable. The protagonist found the whole idea of her being a gentle girl ridiculous. After all, she was nothing more than an experiment. However, just then, she sneezed. Turning around, he saw her with a pained expression. With that, the poor alchemist realized he would have to make this sick girl take a bath. Sometime later in the bathroom, he used a scanner to check if she had any kind of virus inside her. However, even after scanning 3 times, the device couldn't detect anything. He was in disbelief that he would have to let one of his experiments use the bathroom. He told her to hurry up and bathe while he left. But the apocalypse girl looked confused and he immediately understood why. He pointed at the door, saying he was going that way, then pointed at her, telling her to just obey that. After signaling the action, he told her to step in and be done with it. She thanked him, saying she understood. But then she obeyed immediately. He jumped in shock. However, with his eyes closed, he started wondering why he was even embarrassed. He was agreed. But as he opened his eyes confidently, that confidence lasted for only a second before he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Sometime later, he was holding his shower head, nose pinched shut. Frustrated that she was causing so much trouble, he was even having to help with this. He applied the shampoo and warned her not to open her eyes or she would go blind, and that wouldn't be his responsibility. Then he told her to turn around and sprayed water on her face to rinse the soap off. Watching her expression, he couldn't help but think that this biological creature made of carbon had done an excellent job of deceiving him. He shut off the water, told her to drive herself, and said he was leaving. And he warned her that this was the last time he would help. She had learned now, so he wouldn't be taking care of her anymore. However, he stepped right into his tragic fate, did a full flip, and fell straight into the water. The poor guy even hit his head and groaned in pain. At that moment, he regretted not just taking her to the machine room and blasting her with a water gun instead. She looked a bit confused but tried to help him up. That's when Cheese entered, saying he had found the collar of revolt, which would stop her from attacking. But then he saw the scene. Without another word, he turned and left, saying that it looked like the two of them had already worked things out. He slammed the door shut, only to open it again, telling Izzo that if he planned on doing anything, he better wear a protective suit. With that, a bar of soap came flying at him and he was gone. Standing outside, Cheese muttered that it was amazing. For all of Izzo's brilliance as an alchemist, he had absolutely no experience. He looked at a picture on the wall and told Master to rest in peace. He would take care of the boy. A little while later, he stepped in to help with the experiment. He grabbed a hair dryer, plugged it in, and started drying her off. However, upon seeing the shape of the device, she suddenly remembered the countless blasts she had suffered in her past life. He was speaking with his eyes closed, saying that her hair was still wet. But when he opened them, she was gone. He wondered where she had run off to, then noticed her trembling behind the curtain. Having no idea why she was reacting like that, he pulled back the curtain and told her to come on. It was getting late, but she was curled up in the corner, and he had no clue what had scared her so much. After considering what he had done, he realized it might have been the hairdryer. Thinking back to how Homeric had taken her down in that alley, it made sense that she would have trauma with objects of a similar shape. He let out a sigh, muttering that, without a doubt, she was an incredible hassle. She was still trembling, so he stopped and called for the disaster girl. As soon as she turned, he pulled out the hairdryer. She flinched again, covered her head, and curled up. Then he pressed the button, and a gentle breeze began to blow. Slowly, she opened one eye, and found herself staring at him, pointing the hairdryer at his own face, letting the wind blast him. Her terrified expression shifted into a small giggle. Sometime later, she was drying her own hair and having fun. But 20 minutes passed, and she was still enjoying herself. That's when he realized he should have let her stay scared of the damn thing. 30 minutes later, he yanked it from her hands, telling her that enough was enough. Her hair was more than dry. She seemed like she wanted to play with it more, but he warned her that acting all cutesy wouldn't work. He locked it in a drawer, turned the key, and told her to go to sleep already. The poor girl was still sitting there, clueless. She didn't even know how to talk. Meanwhile, Izzo knew the real problem was just beginning. Where the hell was he supposed to make this weirdo sleep? First of all, there was no way she was sleeping in his bed. That was an unbreakable rule for any true alchemist. However, the moment he looked back, she was already curled up, sleeping peacefully on his bed. He pulled her off, scolding her for breaking his rules. Some time passed, and now he was lying on his bed, while she sat on the floor, pouting. He reminded her that she was an experiment, and experiments weren't allowed on the bed. He was already being generous, letting her sleep on the floor as long as she stayed quiet and didn't move too much. With that, he turned off the light, finally feeling like he could sleep in peace. But then, he stopped to think. Even though she had been aggressive, what if she went into berserker mode in the middle of the night? He turned over, but the poor girl was lying there, completely still, not reacting at all. He rested his head on the pillow again, concluding that the chances of her attacking now were pretty low. He decided to try sleeping until he heard a sound beside him. He told her to stay put. He was trying to fall asleep. 1 second of silence. He smirked, but then she made another noise and he told her to shut it. He turned asking if she was really going to keep this up all night. That's when he noticed she was trembling on the floor. Her expression was one of pain and he was confused. Meanwhile, in another room, Cheese had fallen asleep watching some high-quality content. Izao saw what was on the screen and immediately called it disgusting. He smacked the rat's face, demanding that he wake up. But Cheese just scratched his cheek and rolled over. Izao decided that if he was going to pretend to be asleep, then he'd have to handle this himself. Sometime later, he brought an insect feed and placed it right under Cheese's nose. Immediately, the rat shot up, vomiting. Cursing, he asked what the hell was wrong with his damn friend. But Izao simply replied that he was the one responsible for letting the disaster girl get so close to him. Then Izao demanded he hand over a blanket. He needed one. Cheese smirked, saying he already knew it was for the girl. The boy was always complaining about her, but his soft little heart couldn't bear to see her suffer. Izao, however, explained that tomorrow she had to go through several tests and needed a good night's sleep. Cheese told him to just use one of the 6 or 7 blankets they had. But Izao explained that he had one for each lunar cycle and day of the week. Second Sunday was the day of Ouroboros, so he used blankets representing the infinite cycle. Tuesday and Wednesday were for acquiring knowledge in alchemy, so those were his intelligence-enhancing blankets. Thursday was purification day, so he used the purple one, Master's favorite color. And Friday was for sharpening his criminal instincts, so he slept with a spade-patterned blanket. He was about to explain Saturday, but Cheese interrupted, saying he already knew. That was the infamous disaster blanket. Izao was surprised that he was exactly right, which was why he didn't have any to lend to the girl. Cheese sat down and told him to just give her the disaster blanket, since in theory, she was the disaster. Izao was shocked by the rat's flawless logic and realized he had no argument. He tried to protest, but the rat turned away, saying good night and ending the discussion. As he walked away, Izao wondered why a rat even needed a blanket. Standing in front of several safes, he opened the one labeled Saturday. He placed it on the ground and told her that this was an extremely precious gift, something the master was lending her. With that, she finally fell asleep, curled up under the image of a sinister creature. With dark circles under his eyes, he muttered that he should probably put the anti-revolt collar on her. But his brain was already exhausted. He couldn't react, he just collapsed into sleep. Some time passed and she was no longer under the blankets. Instead, she was standing right next to Izao. Later, a crow held a clock in its beak. It dropped it straight into the mouth of the skeleton. The creature immediately began shouting that it was time for the greatest alchemist of the century to wake up. It repeated and repeated until our boy finally woke up, annoyed that he had forgotten to disable the damn thing because of that crazy girl. That's when he noticed something strange. A weird weight, an unusual breathing pattern. This boy had peculiar instincts. And the moment he realized what it might be, he asked himself, could it be? Of course it was. And he had no idea when she had climbed onto his bed. But there she was sleeping peacefully, not caring in the slightest. At that moment, he found himself thinking, she didn't have a single trait of the disaster she was supposed to be. Right then, Cheese swung the door open, asking how his night went. However, when he looked around, he didn't see the girl and immediately asked where she had gone. Izao said he had no idea. That was enough to make Cheese panic, saying that letting a creature like that roam free was extremely dangerous. Izao agreed it was an extreme threat. He ordered the big rat to go check the monitoring room immediately. Cheese started heading out, but then he noticed something strange. Something was trembling under the blanket. He called Izao's attention to it, but Izao just scoffed, asking if his friend had gone blind. As if a blanket could move on its own. But suddenly, disaster emerged from it, panting. Immediately, Izao tried to explain that she had crawled into his bed during the night. He had no idea what had happened. However, Cheese sat down beside him and nodded, saying he understood. Adolescence was a tough time for a boy. He didn't have to be embarrassed. He was happy for him. Izao cut him off and threw the stink bomb straight at his face. While his friend writhed in agony on the floor, Izao repeated himself. He had already explained that she was the one who climbed into his bed, so he needed to stop spouting nonsense. Sometime later in the experiment analysis room, Cheese ordered her to stop jumping so they could measure her height. With that, they discovered that the girl was 1.71 meters tall. Cheese turned to Izao and said that if he ever wanted to kiss her, he'd have to stand on his tiptoes, since she was 11 centimeters taller than him. Obviously, our boy protested, shouting that he didn't want that at all. The next test was her weight. She came in at 64 kilos. Izao found that odd. Just the components he had placed in her should have added up to at least 800 kilos in total. Then the rat announced it was time for the most critical measurement of all. With a grin, he said Izao got lucky. She had a perfect size 36. Next was the lung capacity test. Izzo demonstrated taking the deepest breath possible and exhaling with all his might into the measuring device. The little bat on the scale lifted slightly and she got excited. He handed it to her, saying it was her turn. She prepared herself, but she was holding her breath strangely, so he told her to just blow like he did. But it seemed she misunderstood completely, because she grabbed his face and blew all of her air directly into his mouth. The poor guy stumbled backward, tripping over the table. And of course that was when Cheese walked in, asking how the breathing test was going. While our boy gasped for air, the rat just nodded, saying he was starting to get used to it. Meanwhile, the Apocalypse Girl was confused as to why the little bat didn't move at all. By then, Izzo was already at the sink, frantically rinsing his mouth. Cheese casually remarked that Izzo was probably the first Perserat in history to do something like this. Our boy snapped at him to shut up. Cheese just chuckled, pointing out that he'd been saying that a lot lately. But he did want to know, was Disaster's kiss any good? Right then, Izzo splashed water straight at him. The rat just laughed, saying Izzo didn't even need the mask. He had tested her dozens of times, she didn't have any viruses. Next was a flexibility test, which showed that she was within normal human limits. Then came the lower body strength test. Again, she had normal levels of strength. Even a hand grip test showed standard results. Izzo commented that considering all this, she was literally just an ordinary person. But Cheese argued that none of that mattered. She probably had a combat mode, that's where her real stats would show. Izzo agreed. It was time to activate that so-called combat mode. Cheese asked how, and Izzo responded. They just had to put her against the cruelest, most evil experiment they had. The scene shifted to a highly dangerous girl sitting inside a cage. She had even made a tiny doll of Izzo, saying she missed him. But Cheese immediately protested. This was too risky. Throwing anyone into a fight with test subject 0 was pure madness. They needed to do things gradually. The first opponent should be something weak, like a rabbit. However, Izzo grabbed a tiny rat and asked if this wasn't the weakest creature they had. She snatched it away, declaring that in this facility, they never used rodents for experiments. Our boy picked up the rabbit and asked if Cheese really thought this would awaken her fighting instincts. But suddenly, she snatched the rabbit away and carried it to the corner. Cheese declared that this was undeniable proof. She had killer instincts. Izzo cheered, saying this wouldn't be as hard as he thought. But of course, she was just petting the rabbit. What the hell did this idiot expect? He collapsed to the ground in disappointment, but then he reached into his pocket, pulled something out, and injected it into the rabbit. Cheese immediately demanded to know what he had just done. Our boy revealed that it was Madness Mutation number 6. Suddenly, the rabbit's eyes changed, and it started twitching violently in her arms. A massive shadow loomed over the girl, and the rabbit finally transformed. Izzo smirked, saying that to awaken her powers, her opponent had to be at least this strong. For now, the creature's name would be Super Wild Rabbit No. 1. The beast was already snorting smoke and winding up a punch, and our boy was eager to see how this fight would unfold. However, Cheese was amazed at how Izzo really had no sense of mercy. As the monster lunged, the rat asked if he wanted to bet whether she would dodge the punch or take it head-on. Izzo said that whoever lost would have to clean the base for a week, and he was certain she would take the hit. With that, the rabbit smashed down with full force. Both of them flinched. The area was empty. Not even the monster knew where the girl had gone. Then the creature felt something strange crawling up its arm. When it looked at its shoulder, she was there. The beast collapsed. But even then, she was just gently petting it. Even the monster itself seemed to blush a little. At that moment, Cheese realized that this girl had zero desire to fight. The next scene had them heading straight for the highly dangerous zone. Apparently, they were going to visit number 0, but the rat still thought it was too risky. However, Izzo replied that if she died, then she was a failure. And a failure only served to teach him how to increase the chances of the next experiment's success. Behind the massive door was number 0. Izzo and Cheese both put on their masks, but his friend kept insisting it still wasn't too late. They should just give up since they had invested too much in this girl. However, Izzo said he needed to see her charge forward with the intent to kill her target. Otherwise, he would never witness her true transformation. He had failed too much recently, and he was tired of it. But then she gently patted his head, leaving him momentarily stunned. He grabbed her hand, reminding her an experiment couldn't afford to pity its creator. She stepped closer, telling him that she would use all the power she had, because if she didn't, she would die at the hands of number 0. Her very existence was meant to become the strongest biological weapon and help him conquer the world. Cheese, however, argued that he should appreciate her looks. It was such a waste to put all of that into combat. Meanwhile, behind the massive gate, number 0 was counting tiny Uzaos. She was making little puppet versions of him. This creature was an extremely high-risk entity, a beast of the Black Plague named Lucille. Just then, someone called her name. She turned around. It was Izzo, saying he had come to talk. She turned into a black mist, gripping the cage's bars, and her voice lit up with excitement. It had been exactly 1,322 days since they last saw each other. But Izzo simply stated that he was there to inform her. He had finally created the absolute disaster. She was no longer the strongest creature in his possession. Lucille was shocked. Immediately, she denied it, saying it was impossible. She was the most powerful being in this entire lab. Izzo simply told Cheese to bring in the final disaster. but she had already run forward and hugged Izzo. Clutching the cage, Lucille was confused. No, this wasn't confusion. It was jealousy. She snarled, demanding that the filthy blonde take her hands off Izzo. The little disaster hid behind him, and our boy introduced her to Lucille, the final disaster, the strongest creation he had ever made. If Lucille wanted to reclaim her title as the strongest experiment, she would have to defeat the blonde. Lucille bit her lip in rage, then grinned. Fine, but if she won, then Izzo would have to spend an entire day with her. He agreed to the deal immediately. Then she added if he stayed for a day, he would also have to let her hug him while he slept. But our boy immediately said that was way too much. This Lucille was undeniably strong, worthy of being experiment number 0. She told him not to worry, she would crush his new creation. Izzo walked away, saying she just had to prove it. He left through the door, warning the final disaster. If she didn't fight this time, she would really die. And if she died to Lucille, he wouldn't feel the slightest bit of remorse, because that would only mean she was a failure. Furthermore, he wouldn't interfere or try to save her. She looked confused until he untied the cord that connected them. The door slammed shut in front of her, and she flinched in shock. This girl just kept suffering. It was starting to feel cruel. She banged against the door, but Izzo stood on the other side, clearly unfazed. He muttered that he was right. This was how a true Persered descendant should treat their experiments. Finally, everything was back on track. He then headed to the monitoring room. She's asked about the conversation, but Izzo just ordered him to release Lucille. The rat was irritated, but still pressed the button. The cage began to rise, and Lucille stretched her limbs, saying it had been far too long since she could properly move. The room was filled with cameras, and she immediately looked at one, telling them both to prepare themselves. They were about to witness an incredible spectacle. She's immediately handed Izzo a bag of chips, saying this was going to be a good one. But Izzo grumbled. He was getting sick of everything tasting like cheese. The rat got offended, saying that he never used to complain about this before. Then he assured him, if Lucille actually went for the kill, the collar would activate, cutting off Disaster's powers. It was time for another bet. Who would win this fight? The rat bet on Lucille. If he won, he wanted control of the TV remote for a week. Izzo bet on the final Disaster, because if she didn't win, she would die. Inside the chamber, Lucille told her to stop banging on the door. It was impossible to open. Then she started wondering, what was up with this girl? She didn't have the slightest desire to fight, but she activated her powers anyway, saying it didn't matter. Once she finished her off, she would have Izzo all to herself. At that moment, she said things were getting dangerous. Lucille was advancing, and the Disaster girl hadn't reacted at all. Lucille reached out, preparing to absorb her as her next nutrient. But suddenly, something grabbed her arm. It was the little blonde Disaster. Lucille had no idea how she moved so fast. Immediately, the two boys grew excited. Finally, she was entering combat mode. They began high-five, thrilled that things were finally getting serious. But then the little blonde simply started walking. Lucille was confused. What was she trying to do? Then she pointed at the door, and that was when both of them realized. She was asking Lucille to help her break it open. Obviously, experiment number 0 was furious at that ridiculous request, but the little blonde just smiled and nodded. That was exactly what she wanted. At that moment, the monster started laughing and went completely insane. She turned to the camera, addressing little Izzo, saying that this last creation of his was nothing but an idiot. She grabbed the girl's arm and said she would show her the easiest way out of this room. Lucille's poison began to spread. She warned that the Black Plague virus would turn her into a pile of bones in no time. The blonde collapsed to the ground while Lucille laughed, saying it was far too easy to defeat this so-called disaster experiment. She then grabbed her by the face and told her to always remember. Little Izzo belonged to her. On the final disaster's body panel, red alerts filled the screen. She's warned that the virus was spreading at an extreme rate, compromising both her organs and her entire bloodstream. Izzo said that was impossible, since the blood they used for her was completely immune to any type of virus. But there she was on the ground, clearly and severely infected. Lucille sat there laughing, saying this wasn't even fun. She shouted at him to stop this immediately, but Izzo told him to calm down. He explained that only 30% of her blood, 42% of her organs, and 38% of her nerves were infected, meaning nothing lethal. He was certain that the moment she reached the brink of death, her powers would activate. However, Lucille was stomping on the girl's head. Calling out to Izzo, she asked if this was all he had to offer. While the blonde couldn't say anything, Lucille taunted her. Where was that burst of energy she had when she begged for help to open the door? She shouted at him to stop once again because the virus had already spread to 70% of her body. But Izzo replied that she had a mechanical heart, which was impossible to infect. Besides, the virus hadn't reached her brain. Lucille scoffed, saying that it seemed like Izzo didn't care about the girl at all. And if that was the case, then it was time to end this. The virus seemed to intensify, spreading throughout her entire body. The blonde began to float, and Lucille smirked, saying she would now begin absorption. Biting into her cheek, she noted that for such a flawed experiment, she actually tasted pretty good. The plague beast then sank her teeth into the girl's stomach, saying that now the real feast would begin. She's urgently announced that he was activating the collar. 90% of that experiment's body had already been compromised. But just as he was about to press the button, Izzo grabbed his hand. The rat asked what he was doing, but the boy insisted. The time hadn't come yet. Cheese thought his friend had lost his mind. Did he seriously want to watch Lucille devour the experiment? But Aizo snapped at him to shut up. You're just a stupid rat. You only care about her because she's pretty. You've never been this involved with the other experiments. You can't forget the true goal of the Perseid family. Both Lucille and the girl were just tools for the real ambition. But then, a trembling voice called out, Master. The screen was flashing with alerts, and he saw that the request had come from the girl. Cheese was shocked to see that the disaster had spoken, asking if Izzo had taught her anything. He replied that maybe, just a little lesson the night before. A little earlier, when she tried to climb onto his bed, he had kicked her off, warning her that experiments didn't sleep with him. But when he glanced at her, she looked shaken and sad. So he cleared his throat and said, if she called him master, he would make an exception, letting her lie there for 30 minutes. Even though her vocal cords had been removed in the past, the new body he created obviously had no injuries. However, even as she tried, nothing came out. That's when he realized the truth. She had vocal cords, but she had forgotten how to speak. He leaned down and told her to repeat after him. He exaggerated the mouth movements, slowly forming the word, master, person. She watched intently, but still couldn't say anything. The boy was cruel. He wondered how someone could be so slow. She tried again, but all that came out was a tiny squeak. He covered his face, realizing that apparently there was no helping it. He turned away, telling her to just go to sleep already. But after returning to her blanket, she kept trying over and over to repeat the movements he had shown her, until just as she was about to fall asleep. For the first time, she whispered, Master. Back in the battle, she was calling out for her master. But Lucille scoffed, saying her pleas were pointless. She was nothing but a failure to him, and now it was time for her to be devoured. But right then, Lucille's collar activated, and she collapsed to the ground. A thermal discharge coursed through her body and she couldn't move. She called out for Aizo. Obviously, he was the one who had pressed the button. Izzo nonchalantly admitted that Cheese was right. It would be too risky to lose the implants they had placed in her. Cheese immediately asked if he only pressed it because his creation had called him master. He scoffed. Of course not. I would never do something like that. Now he was going to retrieve this useless tool. Cheese wanted to follow, but Aizo stopped him. Not necessary. Lying motionless on the ground, the final disaster remained still, until suddenly, someone in a hooded cloak appeared. She turned her head, calling out, Master. But Aizo immediately shut her down. Stop saying that. He scowled. You don't deserve to call me that. He was cold, but at the same time. He picked her up in his arms and carried her out of there. She kept repeating master, but he kept telling her to be quiet and prepared to go into confinement. As he walked past Lucille, she asked why. In all the other experiments he had sent her to fight, when they were on the brink of death, he never interfered. So why did he save this girl who was inferior to her every way, whether in physical strength, combat power, or intelligence? Izzo replied that it was because she had numerous transplanted organs, and if she were devoured, the experiment would have trouble continuing. Lucille then responded that in that case, there was no problem. Meanwhile, Cheese was reading some high-quality material, thinking that Aizo should stop with these little theatrics while also noting that the White Queen had some rather impressive qualities. But suddenly, something strange happened. Lucille's stabilized temperature began to drop. The alarm started blaring and Cheese jumped in shock. Izzo was about to leave when he received a message from Cheese telling him to get out of there immediately. Our boy asked why he was so scared, and Cheese warned that Lucille's suppression collar had broken. He froze, and as he turned around, it was already too late. She was right next to him. Lucille sighed, saying it was a shame, but this time the collar wasn't going to work. As a good alchemist, he should know that viruses sometimes adapt to what they are exposed to. For over 1,000 days, she had repeatedly activated its effect, and finally in the last week, the plague viruses in her body began adapting to the cold and found a way to resist it. Izzo tried to calm himself. He couldn't provoke her any further. So he told Lucille that she won and he would fulfill his promise. But she laughed and said that spending a day with her was no longer enough. He removed his mask and she looked at him with curiosity. She placed a hand on his face and the virus began spreading across his body. For some reason, even though this boy was on the verge of death, his face was turning red. Lucille was absolutely delighted, saying that she could finally understand every activity of his cells. Looking at the screen, Cheese was panicking, but Lucille told him to calm down. She had placed the virus inside him, but it was still dormant because she didn't want to harm her little Aizo. The virus started spreading toward his mouth, and suddenly, she noticed something very strange. The Black Plague virus encountered some of the final disaster's saliva cells. Obviously, at that moment, she became furious. She understood exactly what happened. She grabbed the blonde's face, demanding to know how she dared to kiss her Aizo. Cheese knew there was no point in trying to lie. After all, she had a cellular level recognition ability. Once again, her virus began invading the final disaster's entire body. She lifted her high into the air, declaring that this was unforgivable. She would invade every single cell in her body and ensure she suffered the worst possible death. As the poor final disaster struggled in pain, Izzo had no idea how to get out of this situation. Lucille had total control over her body and cells, making her resistant to any type of weapon. The freezing collar had been the only solution, and now without it, he had no idea what to do. He still had the void substance, but it was still in testing and the entire base could be destroyed if he used it. Watching as she crushed his experiment, he wondered if there was truly no solution. At that moment, Cheese said he knew what to do and Izao immediately asked how. The rat explained that Lucille had a deep obsession with him, and that was the only way to stop her. Meanwhile, Lucille was muttering that she couldn't understand why she couldn't enter the brain or the heart, but she would consume everything else. That's when Izao called out to her. He pointed the slime transformer at himself, saying this was his final warning. The monster scoffed, asking if she was really being threatened over that idiot. To which he replied that the girl wasn't important, but the parts he had transplanted into her were. Without them, he couldn't conquer the world or restore the Perseid family's glory, which would take away his entire reason for living. Cheese muttered to himself, admiring his acting skills. And surprisingly, Lucille seemed to agree. Izao was shocked at how easily she gave in. Maybe this was the way to control her, even if it was humiliating. But she kept devouring the final disaster, saying that after consuming everything, she would help him conquer the world anyway. The virus continued spreading and Izao realized he had no choice but to use his trump card. Cheese grinned, saying it looked like he had just been stalling since he had a backup plan all along. But the truth was that this trump card was embarrassing and Izao really didn't want to use it. So he sighed and told Lucille that if she let the girl live, he would sleep with her in his arms for the next few nights. She immediately froze, eyes wide. She approached him, asking if that was really true. In her mind, she was already imagining how wonderful it would be. Izao could tell from her reaction that she was picturing way too much. So he asked if she agreed. She hummed thoughtfully, and then said that maybe, just maybe, she could forgive that piece of trash. But she had two conditions. He asked what they were, and she grinned. The first was that she would be released from her cage and the girl would take her place, locked away forever. Izao knew he would figure out another way to suppress her later, but for now he agreed. Then she moved on to the second condition. She started extracting the virus and ordered the trash girl to wake up. She told her to watch carefully, because she was about to do something. She grabbed Izao's face, saying she was furious that damn girl had stolen his first kiss. He already knew what was coming and tried to explain that the final disaster didn't even understand these concepts. But it was too late. Lucille had already launched her attack. The final disaster, of course, saw it happening and began to wonder why her chest was hurting so much. Our boy couldn't break free and Lucille was relentless with her full assault. He kept pushing away the damned woman who wouldn't let go, while Cheese muttered that, as a friend, he was happy. Or maybe he was sad. He wasn't quite sure how to feel. The torture finally ended and Lucille stood there completely satisfied. She even commented that just like before, he was still using the same lavender-flavored toothpaste. Meanwhile, Izao was frantically spraying his mouth, but Lucille just smiled, saying it was pointless. Her cells had already invaded his body. As he collapsed to the ground, the final disaster kept feeling that strange pain. She didn't understand what was happening. Meanwhile, the virus was running through her blood, until suddenly her red blood cells detected the virus and attacked it. Lucille turned back only to see that the girl had been purified in an instant. She started to say it was impossible, but before she could finish, she was grabbed by the neck and lifted off the ground. The girl's arm transformed and both alchemists instantly recognized it, the arm of the Ashen Angel. The final disaster started speaking, saying she hated something. It wasn't clear what since she still couldn't talk properly. But Lucille was burning. The scene then shifted to a man standing in the middle of a desolate wasteland. He muttered that the creature had already consumed all the fluids and poisons he had given her. So why wasn't she losing consciousness? She prepared an attack and hurled it toward him. He lowered his head, saying it didn't matter. Kachao had managed to escape the island, and that was enough. But then, out of nowhere, a towering woman with purple hair appeared and scolded him, telling him to stop sacrificing himself without permission. A barrier materialized, blocking the attack, and he called her name. The blow was neutralized, and a moment later, she cupped his face, telling him, from now on, he wasn't allowed to abandon her like that. He leaned in closer, about to kiss her, but instead he got stomped in the face, and the woman coldly stated that the kiss scene wouldn't be shown, because she didn't want to see his disgusting tongue. Apparently, all of this was a movie recording, and if you're confused, so am I. I'm just following along, and it seems like this is part of the story, so we're not lost. It turns out the phoenix in the scene was real. They were even feeding her shells to eat. And all of this was happening in Gordon City, on the set of a movie starring the White Queen, which, if I remember correctly, was the same story our rat boy was reading earlier. The White Queen wasn't just the second-ranked hero of the Golden City. She was also the most famous actress in the world. The poor guy acting in the movie was immobilized, and the woman beside him apologized, saying he was the only person they could find. But the White Queen scoffed, saying this man was nothing compared to the one she truly liked. His expressions were terrible, poorly done, emotionless. The assistant nervously admitted that they knew he wasn't up to her standards, but they were running out of money after auditioning over 2,000 people. But the queen just shrugged, saying it didn't matter. They could just take $200 million from her bank. That was when someone ran up with urgent news and she asked what they mean. What was this about her bank being robbed? We all know exactly who did it. A woman reported that the criminals had used a gas device. It was a normal human and someone who looked like a rat. She showed the device, and the moment the White Queen saw it, she recognized the symbol The masked woman added that even Homerica, an extremely competent officer, had been turned into a slime by an unknown weapon. She was about to suggest gathering reinforcements, but the White Queen cut her off, ordering that no one interfere. The masked woman protested, saying it was impossible to handle alone. That region was the execution zone of the heroes, but the queen began transforming. Her hair turned white, her eyes gleaming with an otherworldly radiance. She stepped forward, declaring that the so-called execution zone of the heroes was irrelevant to her, and those criminals. They seemed to have the answers she had been searching for a long time. She commanded her group to abandon everything else, to track those criminals down as quickly as possible. The actress on set hesitated and asked what they should do about the movie. The White Queen simply said to cancel everything for now. She turned to leave and suddenly stopped. She had almost forgotten about him. She walked over to the unfortunate actor, asking if he really wanted to kiss her. He stammered, trying to apologize, but she conjured an extreme ice block and shoved it into his mouth. She watched him suffer for a moment, then remarked that he was lucky. She would forgive him this time. And as she walked away, she coldly stated, "No one in this world is allowed to touch my lips." The scene shifted, a fallen bucket on the ground, a glimpse into someone's past. A woman sternly told a young girl that she wasn't allowed to play until she finished cleaning the floor. The child clutched a teddy bear, one that looked remarkably similar to the one the final disaster also had. The woman yanked the bear from her hands and stomped on it. The girl pleaded, begging, "Aunt Jiman, please stop." But the man beside her was the one who got slapped. The figure who appeared to be the White Queen's father grabbed her, telling Jimin not to treat her like that. But Jimin simply reminded him, it was her who took them off the streets. It was her who made sure they didn't starve to death. The father, called Mailer, had no response to that. A man suddenly appeared behind Jimin and asked if this was the family providing children to serve as soldiers. She smiled and said yes, that the offering was this girl. The father, however, was terrified, demanding to know who this man was and why he had entered without knocking. The mysterious man replied that the Ming Quan did not need permission to enter any place in this kingdom. The father flinched upon hearing that name and turned to Jimin, asking what she was thinking. She responded that it was obvious she was securing a good home for this child. The girl would be taken by this organization and trained from a young age to become a soldier. The man stepped closer, asking if this was the girl, and Jimin told him not to be deceived. She was young, but she was strong. She could even endure 3 days without eating. The man observed her carefully, seeming to like the determination in her eyes. He declared that she would be taken, and in the next second, he was already leaving with her. Now I get it. This was actually the backstory of the final disaster, huh? And now we're back to the present. She was in the room, looking at a piece of that story. Meanwhile, the alchemists were analyzing the rabbit, which was mysteriously losing a ton of fur from its chest, and they had no idea why. She's asked if the disaster was okay, and Aizo replied that, at the very least, her vital signs were stable. A quick flashback to a few years ago. A girl was using healing magic, channeling power into the leader of the underworld hounds known as the Hunting Master. The man from the earlier story, called Doberman, introduced himself to the master, who asked about the assassination. Doberman listed several names of allies, stating that all of them had died. The Hunting Master was in disbelief. How was it possible for so many to have failed in killing the traitors of the Latoma dynasty? Doberman clarified everyone had died, except for Yorkshire. She had disappeared. It seemed like everyone had dog names. The master was visibly shaken and thin. We were back in the present, with Isso pacing around the room. He suddenly shouted that he had an idea, and Cheese groaned, telling him to stop yelling so much. Isso declared that he was tired of calling her final disaster, so she needed a codename, and her codename would be Alpina. He asked if Cheese wasn't curious about why he chose that name, but the rat just told him to get to the point. He recalled that his master once said that Alpina was her favorite flower. It symbolized young women. However, he told the rat that he wasn't going to explain the meaning behind the name. With that, the two of them celebrated. She had officially become an extremely dangerous experiment. Isawa commented that her biggest advantage was her gentle personality, but the biggest problem was how unstable her powers were. The first mission was to understand how she activated her arm. The first time was when she was afraid of sleeping alone in the cage. She's immediately claimed that the solution was obvious. She activated her power whenever she wanted to sleep next to Izao. Izao ignored that and said the second time was when he crouched, and she must have interpreted it as him being attacked by Lucille. That was when she activated the thermal pressure vaporization cannon. She's immediately interrupted, asking since when it had such a ridiculous name. Izao proudly stated that it had that name since the moment she obliterated Lucille, and he thought it sounded awesome. Cheese strongly disagreed. Izao then pointed out the most interesting thing about the attack. It had nearly reached the temperature of the sun, even managing to completely vaporize the Black Plague virus. Cheese commented that if Lucille hadn't been equipped with the ice collar, she definitely would have died. At that moment, Lucille was still submerged, suffering in recovery. Suddenly, Alpina's stomach rumbled. Izao turned to look, and she clearly looked like she was starving. Then she pointed to herself and said, "Hungry, master." Apparently, she had learned to talk out of nowhere. She's asked why they had never seen Izao feed her before. Izao replied that he simply assumed a creature destined to bring the final disaster wouldn't need something as primitive as food. However, she didn't need to worry. They had plenty of highly nutritious and energy-rich meals. Sometime later, Cheese stared in disbelief, asking if he seriously prepared that for her. But Aizo confidently said yes, it was perfect. The poor wild dragon, who had been peacefully sleeping, was about to become food. The dragon woke up groggy, asking what the two of them were doing there. Then his expression suddenly turned friendly, saying he was desperate to get out of the restrictive gear he was wearing. Isao smiled, telling him that he would indeed have a chance to redeem himself. The dragon was excited, until Izzo finished his sentence, saying he was about to become the girl's next meal. His expression immediately changed. Cheese protested, saying that the Storm Malice dragon was the only true dragon they had, and it would be a waste to throw him away like this. But Aizo disagreed. He believed that if Alpina consumed him, she would unlock a new form. He ordered her to devour him. She repeated his words, and suddenly, she was on the dragon's horns. The poor thing was crying in desperation, begging for his life, swearing that he would never talk bad about the boss again. But Ezo coldly replied, "Too late." Alpina got ready and chomped down on his horn. But obviously, that only ended up hurting her mouth like an idiot. Some time later, they were just boiling instant noodles instead, so that's what she was going to eat. 3 minutes later, it was all ready and Alpina's eyes were shining. Our boy handed over the chopsticks and immediately asked what the crazy girl was doing. Obviously, she was eating with her hands without a care in the world. He warned her to be careful since the food was hot. Meanwhile, Chess was wondering if she really didn't know how to use chopsticks or if she was just that starving. However, she kept eating until she suddenly stopped for a second, then cried and said it was delicious. Izao, as cruel as always, just told her to stop crying over instant noodles because it was embarrassing. Chess, on the other hand, understood that she probably hadn't eaten many good things in her life. The protagonist then said that it was just like his friend, who, being a rat, used to sneak into this place to steal cheese until the day he got caught and almost got shot. But Chess told him to shut up, saying that he had heard that the protagonist begged for milk until he was 3 years old. Izao threw his chopstick at his friend, saying it was his mother's fault for telling him there was something inside the magic box. The two started fighting, things flying everywhere, while Alpinia ate peacefully. Our boy called the rat a filthy thief, but Chess replied that stealing cheese wasn't an insult for a rat. It was actually a compliment. With that, she finally finished eating, handed the bowl back to our boy, and said it was delicious. He then wiped her mouth, saying it was ridiculous how messy she got just from eating something like that. However, her stomach was still growling. A little while later, there were piles and piles of instant noodles, and she was still devouring them. But at least now she had learned how to use chopsticks. Once again, she wiped her mouth and handed the bowl to Izao. He told Chess to prepare another one, but Chess informed him that, unfortunately, that was the last one. An hour later, Izao was desperate, telling her to stay away. It was his last box of chocolate, and he begged her to show some mercy. Meanwhile, he wondered why she was acting like this now with chocolate when she had been normal with instant noodles. The girl was crawling like a monster, looking at him with a pleading expression, saying she wanted more of that thing. Seeing himself cornered, Izzo had no choice. He immediately opened the wafers and started eating. His mouth was full, but man, she came for the theft. The poor guy had no options left, and now you might think this girl is going too far. Let the guy eat his wafers in peace. A while later, he was lying on the ground, completely done, but the hunger wasn't over. At that moment, Chess got scared. He was already standing in front of his cheese shelf, prepared to defend it with his life. This was the secret stash he had worked hard for years to build. However, Alpinia crouched down and started sniffing. She immediately realized she was on the ground, placed her hand down, and activated her angel arm. The moment the big rat looked up, the ceiling was melting. He jumped back, screaming that they were doomed, and at that moment, she dived in. As soon as she stood up, he pointed his weapon at her and warned that stealing Izzo's sweets was one thing, but this cheese was sacred. But in just 1 second, she was already in his face with the angel arm, touched the weapon, and snatched it from him. The poor guy had no way to hold on to it, as the heat almost burned his little hands. The moment he looked ahead, the entire weapon had already melted into nothing. The poor guy collapsed to the ground, knowing the end was near. She grabbed the first box and started eating his cheese. A few seconds later, all of them were empty on the floor. Meanwhile, the big rat lay on the ground, saying this was truly the final disaster. Meanwhile, in the monster prison, the Abyssal Eye asked the dragon if he was okay since he had heard that he was supposed to be fed to disaster. However, the dragon said they gave up on that plan since he was a very strong dragon with an extremely resistant body. He was about to show that his horn was the strongest part, but at that exact moment, the thing completely shattered. He screamed in despair, saying that his most majestic part was gone. A little while later, the final disaster was back, locked up where she had been created. Isso said that after countless tests, it had been proven that she had zero resistance when it came to sweets, especially chocolate. As soon as she tasted it, she would enter a hunger frenzy where nothing would survive, even going so far as to use her angel arm. At that moment, he turned around and asked why his friend wasn't saying anything. The big rat was foaming at the mouth, saying that she had eaten 400 blocks of the most expensive cheese in existence. His vintage collection was over 140 years old. And that was why this perverse experiment needed to be punished in the most severe way possible. He prepared his saw, saying that first he would start by cutting her into at least 1,200 pieces. Ezao, however, simply commented that she was still cute. Then the rat said he would wash her eyes with the two cruelest fluids they possessed. Again, Ezao said she was still cute, but the rat insisted that she deserved to be bitten by the brain-sucking mosquito. Yet again, Ezao said she was cute. Finally, the rat said that at the very least she needed a few smacks to learn her lesson. Even though Izzo had been saying she was cute, he was actually thinking that she really did need to be punished. Otherwise, they would never get to eat any more delicious food in this place. Later, he asked if she was ready for a punishment, and for a cruel alchemist, I expected something a lot more chemical, to be honest. He thought that since she had such a childish mind, that the best form of punishment was still to cause pain. With that, he delivered the first attack, and the poor girl cried out in pain. While she was being struck without mercy, he told her that this was for being greedy and eating all the chocolates and all that cheese. Sometime later, the girl really got sucked in and was now crying desperately. Izzo told Chess that this would teach her not to repeat the same mistake. The rat agreed, but said the real problem now was that they had nothing left to eat in this base except for experimental food. The protagonist's stomach growled, and he agreed, saying that they hadn't even had dinner yet. With that, she got beaten up again. Then the rat mentioned another big problem. When they went out to buy or do something, were they just going to leave her alone in the base? Izzo said that was impossible because she would destroy everything while they were gone. Looking down at the poor girl, he said he had no choice but to take her along. Sometime later, he was putting on his vest, and the rat was fastening his belt. He adjusted the buckle, threw on his cape, packed his poisons, and it was time to go hunt for food. Meanwhile, Alpinia just stood there, staring at the two of them. They taught her to raise her arm and strike some poses to look cool the next time something like this happened. Then Izzo ordered the activation of the Matrix teleportation, targeting the Beacon District. The teleportation circle was gigantic, and the three of them were right in the middle of it. She grabbed Izzo's hand, making him wonder how weird it was or how much her personality fluctuated. With that, Chess started counting to 3 and then covered her eyes. The teleportation activated, and an alchemy circle appeared in another part of the city. With that, our boy emerged, spreading his arms and welcoming them to the paradise of crime, the Golden City. They were standing on top of the city's lighthouse, one of the 32 teleportation points. Izzo said that out of all the places, this one was still his favorite, since he could see everything from above. Disaster took a look and was impressed. Meanwhile, the big rat asked if they were heading straight for the megastore. But the boy replied that for now, they would stop by a clothing store because the girl looked peculiar. They would go down Camilla Avenue, where there was definitely something perfect for her. The rat, however, pointed out that that place only had expensive clothes, and on top of that, their bank money was already running low. To which Izzo responded that that was exactly why they would also use this opportunity to scout for their next heist. He told the girl to hold his hand, and as soon as she did, he jumped off the lighthouse with her. Mid-fall, he activated anti-gravity alchemy. The symbol on his neck glowed, and she slowly opened her eyes, until she realized they were floating. Our boy led the way, while the big rat said that as soon as they landed, he wanted at least one hot dog. The scene then shifted to a part of the city known as Amberlit. In the middle of the fountain stood a golden statue of a woman. Alchemy Girl was fascinated, while Izzo wondered why the rat was taking so long just to buy a hot dog. Then he noticed a little boy standing in front of him, saying that his little sister was climbing really high. Our boy laughed, thinking that was impossible. There were way too many people patrolling that area. That's when he realized the boy had said little sister. He looked to the side, and sure enough, there she was climbing the statue. From below, he shouted for her to get down immediately, but she just sat on the statue's head and waved at her master. Meanwhile, the rat was arguing with the hot dog vendor, saying that he had told the guy 1,000 times not to put anything sour on his hot dog. He took a bite and celebrated, saying it took a while, but finally had the perfect taste. Then he remembered Izzo. At that moment, he saw 2 policemen walking by and pointing up. Noticing the crowd gathering around the statue, he wondered how it was possible for him to disappear for just 10 seconds and for all this to happen. The officer grabbed a megaphone, saying that the Camilla statue was extremely important, so she needed to come down immediately. But the girl just shook her head, signaling no. The rat knew that climbing that statue without authorization was a serious crime in the City of Heroes. He put on his sunglasses, knowing he had to act fast. First, he was going to flee and leave his partners behind, because that's how a villain survives. Meanwhile, Izzo threw a flashbang in the air, which exploded in front of the statue and everyone around it. As he did, he muttered to himself that he would never take that woman out of the lab again. The police officers were then all taken down by the big rat, using his tail to wield a knife. He ordered Izzo to grab the girl because, at that moment, he was going to act like a hero. But our boy replied that he saw very well that the rat had just tried to escape alone. One of the officers started to regain consciousness, but as soon as he tried to stand up, he tripped over his own uniform and face-planted onto the ground. Apparently, the trio had escaped with ease and were already in another part of the city. However, our boy was exhausted, saying that one day this idiot was going to get them all killed. That's when someone nearby told them to get their filthy hands off and move away from the store. The employee beside him said that the golden legacy was extremely important and couldn't be tainted by people like them. But Izo just asked Chess what they were going to do about this guy complaining that they were dirty. The rat immediately started licking himself, having fun with it. That's when the shopkeeper threatened to find someone to take care of the two of them, until Chess stuck a banknote to his saliva and the guy was horrified. He kept making a sequence of money, and Iso asked what they were going to do now that the money they were supposed to pay for the mess was all stuck together. The moment the guy changed his attitude, he said that a little cell level was nothing, considering what great customers they were. He happily went to peel the money off with ease while, from inside, Izo waved him goodbye. A little while later, he asked the young master what kind of clothing he was looking for. Our boy said it wasn't for him but for the girl. The seller approached Disaster and asked what such a distinguished young lady was looking for. She looked back with her finger up the mannequin's nose and giggled. The guy was stunned by how beautiful she was, thinking he had never seen such perfection. He hadn't really noticed it when she was outside, but now he could tell she was truly different. Watching Izo ordering her around, he started thinking that this poor goddess was being enslaved by that weirdo. That's when Izo told him to hurry up and bring the best dresses they had. She would try them on one by one. With that, the women brought a whole bunch of them and immediately took the girl away as she called out for her master. He just told her not to make a mess. It was a simple outfit change. He sat down and the guy served him some tea, but our boy said he wasn't in the mood for that. He called out to the filthy rat and told him to hand over the soda he had seen in hiding. Chess handed it over, but told him to quit nagging. He was busy looking for a cool hat. 20 minutes passed and Isao wondered why it was taking so long. One of the women called for help, saying that it wasn't easy to dress this girl. When he pulled back the curtain, she was there, trembling. He then told her to stop making a fuss because he was right outside. With that, the women continued helping her while she kept calling out for her master, to which he responded from outside that he was right there. She called for him again, and once more, he said he was right there. She called for him again, and yet again, he assured her he was there. Then she stepped out wearing a crimson evening gown that cost 159,000. Isao thought to himself that she actually looked good in it. Meanwhile, the shopkeeper asked what he thought. The piece was extremely exclusive. The guy said that his girlfriend deserved something like that, but Izo quickly corrected him, saying she wasn't his girlfriend, she was his servant. If he called her that again, he would have his tongue cut off. The seller was shocked that this guy was buying something so expensive for his servant. He must be filthy rich. But then Izo said that this dress barely met his standards, so they'd better bring something better. The seller assured him not to worry. All the wealthiest people in the city shock here. She then appeared wearing the sacred bloom dress, priced at 300,000. Izo admitted that it was pretty, but it lacked dignity. He told them to bring another. Then she tried on the Golden Empress gown minus 340,000. Man, the price just kept going up. Izo was speechless for a second while the seller kept calling out to the young master. The man explained that this dress was originally made for the Empress herself, so surely it must be to his liking. But at that exact moment, a Batman-style limousine pulled up in front of the store. The staff rolled out a carpet, and suddenly, the shopkeeper looked nervous, saying he had forgotten about today's visitor. He told the three of them to hide and stay quiet, or they would all be in serious danger. Then a door opened, revealing a girl, frame by frame. She was dressed in traditional Japanese clothing and flanked by two demons. From the Haigong family, this was Rina, though she seemed poor, considering she didn't even have sandals. As soon as she stepped onto the ground, she turned and told Akaningu that her feet were cold. The demon woman apologized and said she would take care of it. She prepared a flame attack and sent a blaze from the store. Meanwhile, the rest of the servants were still rolling out the carpet. As soon as she entered the shop, the vendor greeted her as Lady Korea. I thought her name was Rene. Guess we'll find out soon enough. She simply said that she had heard the Gothic Lolita dress was being sold there and she wanted to see it. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, the three were quietly watching. Chess immediately pointed out that, judging by her name, the girl belonged to the Korea family, which was a problem. Iso knew that this was one of the most noble families in the city. Meanwhile, Disaster remained silent. What our boy found strange was that a family like this usually never left the Golden District. So what were they doing here? The carpet was still being stretched out when a shopkeeper told her to follow him. In front of something covered with a cloth, he told her that this was what she was looking for. However, when he turned to look, she had stopped in place. The carpet had run out and the servants apologized. Akathengu immediately cursed them out, demanding to know how they dared not bring enough golden carpet. She declared this to be a severe mistake for the servants of the Korea family and that she had no idea what to do about it. Man, the guy was sweating bullets. He had already drawn his blade as if they were about to put an end to their suffering. The two of them screamed that they would make the sacrifice of the heart, but before they could, their blades disintegrated. The other servant, named Shinku, had activated the Buddha's forgiveness technique. One of the servants thanked him, but was immediately struck in the back, causing both of them to collapse in agony. There they lay, unmoving, as Shinku told her to proceed in peace. Man, was all this really necessary? The girl walked over them like they were stepping stones. Chess even asked if every noble in the center was really this arrogant. But Izo was smiling, saying that this was a great opportunity. His friend wanted to know what he meant, and he said it was obvious. The perfect chance to pull off a kidnapping, someone who was supposed to be in the golden zone. The rat, however, said that killing heroes sounded way less dangerous than kidnapping a member of one of the most powerful families. Izzo insisted, saying that this was how they were going to reclaim the glory that the Perserid family once had. But Chessie was still scared, pointing out that this entire city was built by the families of these people, so there was no doubt they would be hunted down until death. Meanwhile, Renee continued stepping over her servants until she was face to face with the dress. The shopkeeper said he was about to present a true work of art and pulled off the cloth. At the same time, Izzo was teasing his friend, saying he was turning into a coward. That was when they both heard a scream. The so-called Gothic Lolita dress was completely destroyed, or maybe it just had a very peculiar design. The shopkeeper collapsed to the floor, while Renee demanded to know if this was truly the dress that the magical scissors had prepared for her. Akatingu had already drawn her blade, and Shinku declared that this time not even Buddha would be able to save them. Izzo turned to his friend and asked if this was his doing. Chess apologized, saying that the shopkeeper had been really annoying, so he decided to have a little fun with something that seemed expensive. Meanwhile, Alpinia was trying to say that she also wanted to see what was going on. However, since she didn't know how to walk in heels, she ended up tripping, pushing our boy forward. At the same time, Renee was in front of the shopkeeper, ordering him to reveal who had done this. And right at that moment, our boy stumbled out of the dressing room. The shopkeeper immediately became convinced that it was his fault. Chess knew there was no way they were getting out of this one. Hakatingu instantly grabbed Izzo by the tie, lifted him, and asked if he was the one who had done this. Our boy pulled something from his sleeve and without hesitation admitted that yes, it was him. She was surprised by his response, while Chess couldn't understand why he had confessed so easily. Even the shopkeeper was confused, muttering that there was no way to save this lunatic now. Akatingu said she didn't like the way he was looking at her and was about to gouge his eye out. But then, Renee ordered her to stop. She announced that she actually liked that dress. The shopkeeper and the big rat were both startled, wondering if this girl was insane. Akatingu protested, saying that the boy had destroyed her dress, so he needed to lose a finger. But Renee simply asked if she needed to repeat herself. At that, Akatingu immediately obeyed. She released our boy, but slapped him across the face, telling him he better behave. As she straightened his tie, Izzo was already thinking to himself how cool it would be when the headlines tomorrow announced that this woman had been kidnapped. He just couldn't decide whether to use the dragon grenade or the torment grenade. But suddenly, Renee smiled and said that she knew exactly who he was and what he was trying to do. The moment she had stepped into this store, she had felt an overwhelming sense of danger. Issa was confused and surprised. Chess wondered if his presence had really been detected that quickly. Renee took a slow step forward, never leaving the carpet, and stopped in front of him. She then stated that she knew he was just a mere intern at this store. After hearing she was going to visit, he had altered the dress and staged this whole little act just to get her attention. She was certain that all of this was because he wanted to be part of the Korea family. Issa was completely lost. He had no idea what this crazy girl was talking about. But Renee kept going, saying that she admired his courage for risking his life just to get her attention. That was why, if he got down on his knees and kissed her foot, she would accept him as her servant. Akatingu was furious. Well, actually, she wasn't furious. She was envious of the opportunity the boy had just received. Meanwhile, smiling, Renee was thinking to herself that when he bent down, if he seemed too eager, she didn't know whether to step on his head or kick him. But Iso covered his nose and declared that he would never kiss a filthy foot. Both Chess and the shopkeeper were stunned. Akatingu wasn't sure if she should tear his head off. Meanwhile, the protagonist scoffed, saying it was ridiculous for someone from such a rich family to not even have shoes to walk around in. There was no way in hell he was going to kiss something that dirty. Chess was panicking, terrified that this lunatic wouldn't stop adding fuel to the fire. Renee held herself back, but then suddenly, she started crying. She whined that she put perfume on her feet every day, so they weren't smelly. She lifted her hand to slap him, and Azao already had his plan ready. The moment her hand made contact, he would pull the grenade from his pocket, toss it into the room, and the kidnapping would begin. But before that could happen, someone emerged from behind the curtains. Our dear Alpinia had grabbed Renee's wrist. Chess was shocked. He had no idea how this girl had moved so fast. In an instant, a slash came flying, stopping right beside Alpinia. It was Akatingu, ordering her to take her filthy hand off the lady. Ezao realized that now things were really about to get complicated. Disaster just stood there silent while Renee seemed to be admiring her. She told Akatingu to put away her weapon. Akatingu asked why. Renee explained that she was certain the girl wasn't attacking her. She was protecting the boy. Izao was impressed by how composed she was. Then Renee stated that she really liked that girl and wanted to take her. Akatingu didn't remember her boss having such preferences and wondered what kind of books she had been reading. Meanwhile, the shopkeeper had no idea what was going on today. But Renee was getting annoyed. She was thinking that these two were being incredibly arrogant. Meanwhile, Disaster stood there, still completely clueless about what was happening. Then the girl said that judging by the blonde's outfit, she clearly belonged to nobility. But even so, when Renee set her eyes on something, she never gave up. So she simply asked for a price. Of course, Alpinia was still completely confused. That was when Izzo spoke up, saying that she was the one who should be naming the price. Renai asked what he meant by that, and at that moment, he reached into his pocket. He then declared that from this moment on, she had been kidnapped by the #1 villain of the Golden City. Akaning tried to draw her blade, but it was too late. The purple poison was already on the floor. The swordswoman and the servant lost all their strength in an instant, and in the blink of an eye, the girl had disappeared. Now tied to a chair, Izzo smirked and asked, "Where's the like on this video that helps Mamoru make more juicy content for his